Hello, thank you for stopping in at the Spotlight Series. I'm your host, Scott Nerney. Tonight, we are at the Varnum Museum. As I look around, this is a military museum in East Greenwich, right on Main Street. I implore you to stop in, visit their website, and take a look at everything that's here. And we are blessed by having the curator of the museum with us, Patrick Donovan. Welcome to the Spotlight Series.
Thank you, Scott. Welcome to the Varnum Armory Museum. Happy to have you.
I have toured this facility numerous times. Each time I come, I find something different, something new, something I may
Yes.
have passed by. How long has the museum been here?
So believe it or not, it's been here as long as the building itself has been here. So we have a newspaper article that talks about the opening of the Varnum Armory in 1914.
Wow.
And in that newspaper article, there's a little paragraph that mentions that the organization dedicated a room for military artifacts. And so we've been referring to ourselves as being a museum since that time.
And it's named after James Mitchell Varnum. I see a plaque on the wall. Tell us
Correct.
a little bit about him.
James Mitchell Varnum was an amazing person. He lived right here in East Greenwich. He was a lawyer. He was a two-term member of the Continental Congress. He was a judge. He founded the Kentish Guard Militia in 1774. He would go on to become a brigade commander under George Washington in the Continental Army. He would later in the war return to Rhode Island, and he would command all the Rhode Island militia forces. And he does all of this before the age of 40.
Oh.
And I always tell people that when I read that or think about that, it makes me feel like a slacker.
I'm with you there. And little known fact that George Washington was in this area fairly often.
Yes, particularly late in the war, he came through here. He slept in a lot of places, is the joke, but we're pretty confident that he did stay at the Varnum House, which is just a couple of blocks away from here. And we own and operate that property too, by the way. Varnum built the house in 1773, and we operate that as a museum as well.
And you kind of talked about this being maintained as a military museum since 1914. What are really the missions and goals that you try to aspire to here?
So today our mission is to preserve and share Rhode Island military history with the aim to educate, to encourage patriotism, to encourage service of all kinds to our state, country, and local communities.
When you say a military, we're talking from somewhat current day all the way back to the Continental Army War?
Yeah, all the way back to the colonial period. We have artifacts that date back to the 17th century. Our collection spans thousands of objects. We have flags, uniforms, weapons, artillery, art, books, letters that were written by soldiers, military documents. It really spans the gambit. And we not only do we have the museum, but we also operate a conservation lab. So we have a professional textile conservator, we have a document conservator, and they not only work on our own collection of artifacts, but we also help other museums, other historical societies, libraries. We basically work with them to help save and preserve this important Rhode Island history.
It's a uniform from 1700s just doesn't come out of a box and say, look, I'm clean and new.
Right.
It takes a lot to bring that back and keep it. You just can't hang it in the museum and it's done.
That's right. The forces of nature are against these artifacts. Gravity, light, friction, these physical forces basically will cause wear and tear to an object. And through conservation, through restoration techniques, you can slow down that process, but ultimately these objects will eventually disappear. You can't save them forever. And so we do what we can here to make sure that these things exist for a long time for the public to see for many future generations.
And how do people get to come in here and take a look around and meet with you and some of the staff?
So today we're open largely by appointment. We do an open house periodically throughout the year. Memorial Day, Veterans Day, we're open. We're just about to move from being a by appointment model to having regular hours, a few days during the month. But if you'd like to see the museum today, you can go to our website and book a tour. It's varnumcontinentals.org. it's probably easier just to Google search Armory East Greenwich. But you can request a tour. The request will come right to myself, and most likely it would be me or one of our couple of docents that we have that would be more than happy to give a tour.
And as someone who did that the first time I came, it was extremely easy. You guys got back to us right away. We brought a gang of 6 or 8 people in, and they still talk about it to this day, that the things that not only they saw, but every once in a while there's new things that pop up that you've got out of restoration, or things that have come back in after having them out.
Yes. So almost on a monthly basis, we're being offered new artifacts as a loan or a donation. We're constantly, one of the activities that we do is we go out actively and look for Rhode Island history that's at risk of being lost or damaged. If we try to save these objects, we'll do Facebook fundraisers to acquire things at auction, for example, to bring those back home to Rhode Island. So even if you've been here in the last couple of years, I encourage you to come back for another visit. You're going to see things that you have not seen before. We're in the midst of major renovation right now, so half of the museum space is currently being renovated, taken all the way down to the studs, built back. We're trying to restore these spaces to the original early 1900s appearance of the armory. This project will more than double our exhibit space. So right now, today, we sort of stop at World War II, but once we finish this space in the coming months, we're going to extend our exhibits all the way through to the Global War on Terror. We'll have a dedicated room for World War I, World War II, the Spanish-American War. We'll have an exhibit on the Cold War, Korean conflict, Vietnam. But our focus is always on Rhode Island military history. So all the objects that you see, the vast majority, they have a direct tie to a specific individual, to a specific unit from Rhode Island. And because we often know who wore these things, who carried these things, it allows us to tell a much more interesting story. So I always tell people, even if you don't have a strong interest in military history, because of the personal stories, you will find it interesting. And we also we try very hard not to glorify war. We're trying to honor, we're trying to celebrate, commemorate the sacrifice that Rhode Islanders made during war. Our hope is that particularly young kids leave this place with a sense that war is terrible, it's horrible. It should only be a last resort to preserve our freedom, to preserve our rights. And so we try very hard to not glorify conflict.
And to realize that it's people first that are in the trenches, behind the weapons, thinking about ways to end it. There's so much that it's a people thing first.
Absolutely.
And I really praise tribute to what you're doing here to really talk to those people. You've had some stories that we've discussed in the past, so if you want to share one or two about some of the artifacts you have here with the Rhode Island ties.
So one of my favorite, probably one of the more emotional artifacts in our collection is a little Bible, a little leather-bound Bible with a name embossed on the cover, Alfred G. Gardner. Most people wouldn't even notice this object in our museum because your eyes are taken by the weapons, the flags. Easy to walk by it. But I always tell this story on every tour that I lead. So Alfred Gardner is a father of five daughters. He's super devoted to his wife, Adelia. He moves to Providence, Rhode Island right before the Civil War breaks out. When the war breaks out after the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter, Alfred Gardner struggles to decide what he's going to do. He's a very religious person, and he thinks, I can't leave my family, but at the same time, it's my duty to serve my country. And so he struggles with this for several months, and eventually he decides, I must go and serve. And so he ends up in the artillery, Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery. And in that battery, he is a witness to all the major battles of the Eastern Theater of the Civil War, horrific battles. And he would frequently write letters home to his family. And when he would run out of paper, he used this Bible as a diary. So on the margins of the pages, he would write little messages, mostly to his children, words of advice, words of wisdom, some really emotionally charged words. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, the biggest battle in the American Civil War takes place in July of 1863. It's a 3-day battle. 170,000 Americans fight each other over these 3 days. And by the end of the fight, there's 51,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Just unbelievable in scale. And Battery B is right in the center of this big battle. They arrive on day 2, and it's a horrific fight for Battery B. It's hand-to-hand combat at one point, and Alfred would survive that day. And that night, on July 2nd, 1863, he would write the last message in that Bible. On the 3rd day, the Confederates Army under Robert E. Lee decided to attack the center of the Federal Army, the U.S. Army from the north, right where Battery B's position was. And they had a charge. It was known as Pickett's Charge. About 12,000 Confederate infantry attacked. Preceding this infantry charge, the Confederates massed all of their artillery, about 135 guns. And at 1 p.m. on July 3rd, a signal gun goes off, and all of this artillery begins firing at once, focusing their fire on top of where Battery B was located. It was described as being the loudest event in human history at this point in time. They reportedly could hear the gunfire as far away as Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 35 miles away. The men talked about how the ground literally shook beneath their feet. And during this cannonade, Battery B begins to return fire. And at one point, Alfred Gardner he's gunner number 2, so he loads the cannon. He reaches over the carriage of the gun and he grabs a bag of gunpowder. And he's about to insert that bag into the tube of the cannon when at that moment a Confederate shell from 2 miles away arches over the battlefield and smacks the muzzle of Alfred's gun, hits it flush on, explodes. It instantly decapitates William Jones just feet away from Alfred on the other side of the tube. He was gunner number 1. Alfred has his left arm severed just below the shoulder. He gets a gaping wound in his rib cage and he goes down on his back. He's bleeding to death, but he's still conscious. His best friend, his tent mate, Albert Strait, runs over to him. He's the sergeant of this gun. Albert goes to Alfred, and they had made a pact before the battle that if either one of them were to be wounded, the other would immediately stop what they were doing and go to their aid. So true to his word, Albert Strait goes down to Alfred. He says that Alfred is holding his one hand up, and Albert says that they grabbed hands. And he said the first words out of Alfred's mouth was, "Please tell my wife I died happy. Please make sure she gets my Bible." Albert says that he doesn't take the Bible right away. He bids farewell. He turns his back. And he says that he hears Alfred yell out in a loud and clear voice, "Glory be to God. Hallelujah. Amen. I am happy." And he bleeds out and dies. This is a major victory for the Federal Army. They repulse Pickett's charge. They hold the field. Robert E. Lee's army retreats the next day on July 4th. On July 4th, before they bury the 2 men, Albert asked one of his soldiers to go over and retrieve that Bible. That Bible is downstairs in our museum collection. He died with that Bible in his pocket. When you read the message in the Bible, you completely understand why he wanted the family to have this so badly. And the last message in there is dated, again, July 2nd, 1863. He says, "Gettysburg, in battery, all ready for action. I am well in body and my mind is clear about the future. The thought of heaven has cheered me on this march from Falmouth to Pennsylvania." And then he says, "Children, exclamation point, always be of good cheer and always do right. This is the wish of your father." And that would be the last thing that he would write. And the Bible was returned to his widow, Adelia. She treasured the Bible. There's a letter where she actually refers to the Bible as a national treasure, a symbol of the sacrifice made by Rhode Island in the war to end the ugly institution of slavery and to preserve the Union. We have a lot of interesting synchronistic things that happen to us in the museum here. Things have a way of finding their way back to us. And an example of that is related to Alfred. So we know from Alfred's letters that he would often pick wildflowers along the march, at battlefields, and he would mail these wildflowers home to his wife, and he would write the date and where he picked these flowers. We knew that from his letters, and we know many other things about Alfred from his frequent writing. Lo and behold, so I share this a lot on Facebook, Instagram, and tell these stories. And a complete stranger came to us. He was a U.S. Army officer out of Maryland. He says, "Hey, I have this little scrapbook, and inside the scrapbook are all these pressed wildflowers." And he says the author of the scrapbook is Adelia Gardner. Do you think these are the flowers that Alfred picked? So we were just like, I get goosebumps even now just talking about it.
Yeah.
But I was able to make a deal with this gentleman in Gettysburg, and we now have brought this book home. It's just amazing. The flowers are beautifully pressed. You can still see color in the flowers, and it would say, like, picked from the battlefield of Antietam, September 18th, 1862. Just a real time capsule. She wrote poetry about her husband and having lost him, and she has newspaper clippings and things. But it's just amazing this would survive, A, and B, that it would end up back here with his other things. So
just some of the things you'll see here at the Varnum Military Museum that you won't catch in a stuffy U.S. military museum where it's kind of removed from the common person.
Yes.
And the realistic, what happened to our neighbors, and the grounds that we're standing on could have been any of those folks.
Well said. Yep.
Yeah. Patrick, before we let you go, I do want to remind people of the website again.
VarnumContinentals.org.
Okay. And we do have a few questions that we'd like to ask our guests.
Sure.
Tribute to the James Lipton's interviews that he had taken from other folks. What is your favorite word?
Liberty.
Okay. And what noise or sound do you most love?
I would say the guitar.
Okay. And if you had 0% chance of failure, what would you do?
End war.
Okay. What job would you least like to do?
A salesperson.
Okay.
Not my personality.
All right.
I'm an introvert at heart.
And if you go back and talk to your 12-year-old self, give yourself some advice, what would you say?
Save money now. Don't be anxious.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming in.
Very welcome.
Spend some time with us. Folks, we will have, following this, we'll have some shots from downstairs. Don't go away. We'll show you some fantastic memorabilia.
So that is a Civil War cannon. It's known as a James rifle because inside that bronze tube is rifling grooves, spiraled grooves in the bore. That was kind of a newer technology at the time, the early part of the Civil War. But the person that invented this particular rifling to fire a very specific artillery shell, his name was Charles Tillinghast James of West Greenwich. He was an engineer, he was in the Rhode Island militia, and in the years just before the American Civil War actually started, he invented this type of shell that used this type of rifling, and it basically would fire straighter, it'd be more accurate. Its range was about 1,200 to 1,500 yards. And so James rifles were an early technology used early in the American Civil War. Yeah, one of the jewels of our collection is this Colt Gatling gun. This is an early automatic weapon. There are 10 barrels inside that brass jacket. The round brass device on the top is the magazine. It held 104 rifle rounds. And basically it would fire as fast as you could turn the hand crank in the back. Roughly 200 rounds a minute. And this was, of course, revolutionary technology for its day. This is in an era where rifles were single shot, generally speaking. You had to fire one shot and you'd have to take time to reload it. So this was really kind of revolutionary warfare. The little cannon on the end here is a little piece of Rhode Island Civil War history. This was captured by the 10th Rhode Island Volunteers during the American Civil War. Yeah, the flag is actually a recent donation. So this is the first American flag to cross the border into Germany at the end of World War I. The U.S. Third Army was formed under General Blackjack Pershing to basically be the occupation force at the close of the war. And the U.S. Third Army, as they are about to cross the border to be that occupation force, they realized they didn't have a flag at the head of their unit. And a gentleman by the name of Timothy Morris of Providence, Rhode Island, he was a Knights of Columbus secretary. He had this flag in his rucksack, and they pulled the flag out, mounted it to a pole, and it was placed at the head of the U.S. Third Army. And he ended up bringing that flag back home with him. There's a picture of his nieces holding the flag just after the war. Just below the sign here in front, we have a copy of the Providence Journal in 1919 showing the flag being. This is, I found this in our archives, unframed, rolled up in a tube. It's a National Guard recruiting poster. So this was a poster it was actually aimed at African American soldiers who were in the National Guard, and this was a plea to them to remain in the National Guard. This is 1975. So this is coming on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement. This is right at the very end of the Vietnam War. Being in the military was not cool at the end of the Vietnam War. And they were really struggling in recruitment and maintaining force levels at this time. And this poster features William Carney of the 54th Massachusetts. He's the first African American in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. He wouldn't receive that medal, however, until about 30 years after the war, the Civil War. But he was shot 4 times. He was part of a charge at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. And he saw the flag bearer be shot. He grabs the flag. He refuses to let the American flag touch the ground despite being wounded 4 times. His men eventually grabbed him and forcefully drew him to the rear to an aid station. And by the time that he got back to the field hospital, he remarked that he refused to allow the flag to touch the ground. So as the curator, it's my job to ensure the care of the collection, to take care of the building. There's certain things we got to do to modernize the care of the place, but you don't want to change too much. You don't want to. The building itself has its own history. This display case has been showing these objects from World War I literally since World War I itself. I have a picture of this case in 1920. It's exactly as you see it. We don't want to change that. You don't want to ruin the uniqueness of the place. This door, we're renovating what's behind it, but this door is from 1914. So one of my favorite things in the building is this uniform, this officer's frock coat, this private purchase headgear. This was worn by this guy, T. Fred Brown. He went by Fred. He's from Providence, Rhode Island. You can tell by the size of the uniform that he's very short. Even at that time, he's about 5 foot, 5'2", based on the dimensions of the uniform. When the Civil War breaks out, he tries to enlist in the 1st Infantry Regiment to leave Rhode Island. They turn him away because he's too short. And he ends up in the artillery. And he has very strong leadership skills, and he would quickly rise to command Battery B, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery. So this is the same battery as Alfred Gardner in the Bible. He's the commander. At Gettysburg, they arrive on day 2 of the battle, July 2nd. And so the main Federal Army battle line is behind the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. Battery B, it's about 120 Rhode Islanders, 6 cannons, roughly the same number of horses as the men. They get placed 100 or 300 yards in advance of this line, perpendicular to it, way out in the open, and they're faced to the north. And they're deployed their guns, and they're firing against another Confederate artillery battery to the north near Lee's headquarters. And Fred is on a red-colored horse. He's like the only officer on horseback at this point. And he's looking to the west, and he sees a large body of men appear on the western horizon. And he's like, this is our infantry support, thank God. It turns out it's 1,200 howling Georgians, mostly, of Wright's brigade. And they quickly close the gap, and they begin firing on Battery B. And it becomes a complete melee. Fred has the presence of mind to basically organize a fighting retreat back to that stone wall 300 yards to their right. And they end up losing 2 guns. Almost every horse in their battery is shot down. And at the stone wall, there's a gap in the wall of about 50 feet. And today, if you go to Gettysburg National Military Park, that gap in the wall is still there today, and it's known as Brown's Gate, in honor of Fred Brown for saving his battery from annihilation. And so they're able to roll the cannons through that gap in the wall to save them. Fred's just inside the gap in the wall. He's on his horse, and he's holding a pistol in the air, and he's leaned over, and he's yelling at another officer when he's shot in the neck. Bullet enters his neck, nicks his carotid artery, exits the back of his neck. He falls from his horse, and he's basically left for dead. Eventually, reinforcements come up. They beat the Georgians away. They grab Fred's lifeless body, and they drag him back, and they realize he's still alive. He still has a pulse. He ends up in a field hospital for several days, and he's eventually sent home to Rhode Island to recover. And he survives, and he would return to his battery several months later in October of that same year, and he fights out the rest of the Civil War, and he survives. This is where the story gets crazy. 30 years after the battle, veterans return to Gettysburg to basically plan the national park. And Wright's brigade veterans are on the field, and they remembered that they had attacked a Rhode Island battery. And one of their men, Simeon Theus of Savannah, Georgia, he's a jeweler, he's a wealthy guy at this point, he writes a letter to the Providence Journal. He says, can you help us get in contact with these Rhode Island boys? They're not going to forget who we were. The reason why they were trying to get in contact with them, in order to place a monument on the battlefield, that permission, you had to have 2 other units verify, yep, these guys were here, and then they would raise the money, make the money, put it there. So the Providence Journal takes his letter from Simeon Theus, and they give it to Fred Brown. And Fred Brown writes Simeon back, and he says, I, sir, had the honor of commanding the battery that day, and you guys shot me. And Simeon writes back, and he literally says, whoa. He's like, hold on a minute. He's like, I don't want to put words in your head, but were you on a red-colored horse waving a pistol in the air? Because I've been telling this story for decades that you were the only Yankee I was sure I had killed. And the 2 men realize, who they're talking to. And Fred writes back, and he mentions that he was wearing a very conspicuous white hat. He mentions it twice in the letter. Direct from the family, this is the white hat that Fred Brown was wearing the moment that he was shot. Pinned to the hat was this note that we've since had framed. It was pinned on the front of the hat, and it's written in Fred's hand. And it says, "White hat worn by T. Fred Brown, commanding Battery B, blah, 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 at the Battle of Gettysburg." And at the end of the note, it says, "A bullet cut away a small piece from the brim." And if you go around to the back of the hat, you will see a bullet hole on the edge of the hat. And you can even still make out the lead ring from that mini ball that went through his hat. We don't know whether that was the shot that hit him in the neck or not. I mean, who knows? There's, thousands of rounds flying through the air. Now, Maria, when she conserved the hat, she conserved the lining on the inside. We discovered on the crown, you can just make out there's little specks of blood. And it's soaked from the outside to the inside of the hat, which is very interesting. So this is like a moment frozen in time to July 2nd, 1863. And the two men became buddies, and they would write each other off and on for years. And Fred even thanks Simeon for having wounded him. He's like, "If you hadn't wounded me on day 2 of the battle, I surely would have died on day 3. And we've since made contact with the relatives of Simeon Theus. His grandson had a partner, and they lived together in Texas. And we made contact with that partner, and apparently he still has a briefcase filled with family history from Simeon Theus. And in this briefcase was a little lead ball made into a pendant. Apparently Simeon was shot on day 3 of the battle, and he carried this bullet in his leg for 18 years or so, and he had the bullet surgically removed, and he had it made into a pendant, and he wore it around his neck for the rest of his life. And so we're trying to get that brought into the museum to be able to display together.
Wow.
So it's a pretty neat story.
It all comes home.
I think I told you that the gun that's in the State House today in Rhode Island, the gun that Alfred Gardner was manning and loading when he was mortally wounded, we're this close to having the gun transferred here and being able to display all this stuff together. It should be cool.
Well, I mean, personally, would encourage to see it and donate so that we can preserve it.
We'll go to the next 2 rooms. So this room is our colonial, early 19th century room. It used to be the office of our founder and our longest serving president, H.V. Allen. This is his toy soldier collection. Eventually this is going to be moved into the hallway. But most things in here date from the American Revolution. We have a hat, a leather hat that was worn by Captain Lieutenant Benajah Carpenter of Providence, Rhode Island. He was an officer in the United Train of Artillery Militia. They're the founding company of the U.S. Artillery under Henry Knox and George Washington. They were at the Siege of Boston. They participated in the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778. They fought at the Battle of Long Island in New York, biggest battle in the Revolutionary War. And sadly, Benajah Carpenter was shot and killed at the Battle of Long Island. We don't know whether he was wearing this hat or not. We loaned the hat to the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia for their opening year. They told us there's literally like 5 U.S. military hats in existence in the world today from the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
And this is considered to be the best of that remaining group of artifacts. We have the United Train of Artillery's flag from the 1830s. Beautiful piece of American folk art. The coiled rattlesnake with "Do not tread on me, in God we hope." Yep. Yeah. One of the greatest artifacts in the museum today is this flag. This belongs to the town of Bristol. It was kind of rediscovered in the town of Bristol. This is the oldest colonial American flag in existence today. It dates to circa 1695. It was purchased by Nathaniel Byfield as colonel of the Bristol County Militia when they were part of the Plymouth Colony and later the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He presented this to his men around 1695. We believe the flag was carried in King William's War and Queen Anne's War, two very early intercolonial conflicts between New France, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and various indigenous tribes aligned themselves to the different sides. We think that there might be a blood stain in the lower corner of the flag. We've had testing done by the Smithsonian Science Lab. The test results so far is that it's not conclusive, but it's indicative of human blood. And we're working with another company in Massachusetts to help us do further testing. This flag is actually going to go on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Army in Fort Belvoir, just outside of Washington, D.C., for the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army, the birth of the U.S. Army. This represents one of the earliest artifacts from what would become our new military.
What an honor to have something go there.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. We did the conservation here, but they're going to remount the flag in a new display case that they're telling us is going to cost like $30,000, and we'll be able to keep that display case when it comes back to Rhode Island, which is pretty awesome. The only reason why we're able to figure that out, by the way, it used to be a plain red silk flag, but we have the original flagpole finial that's engraved on three sides that gave us a clue as to what this flag was. We have what we think is perhaps the earliest representation of the burning of the Gaspee. It's an oil painting. Unfortunately, it's unsigned, but we can tell by the characteristics of how it's wearing. You can see the crazing, the cracking in the paint. We know that this is very early. I've been working with someone at Brown University to help us identify who the artist is, but we think it's early 1800s. We have a letter dictated and signed by George Washington as a general. It's written to our guy, James Mitchell Varnum. It's about the positioning of troops on the eve of the Battle of Red Bank in New Jersey. One of the incredible treasures that we discovered within our own archives that we had forgotten that we had was a letter written during the Revolutionary War by an African-American soldier in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Rhode Island was the first colony to pass a law that gave enslaved people their freedom in exchange for their service. And Thomas Nichols, who is the author of this letter, is one of those few soldiers that took advantage of that, few enslaved people to take advantage of that new law. He's wounded at the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778. He's writing this letter a couple of years later to his former owners, asking for help to get a discharge. He wants to go back to them because, quote, war is disagreeable to my mind as well as destructive to my health. He talks about having fits and being unable to move. He talks about having no clothes fit to wear, no money. He doesn't know anyone. It's a very sad letter. I think he has PTSD, and it could be one of the earliest, writings of an American soldier talking about what today we would call PTSD. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's one of only 2 letters known to exist in the world that was authored by an African-American soldier in the Revolutionary War. And it was in a box of random receipts in the 1940s and 50s that was donated to us. I almost threw it out. And thank God I went through all the papers and found it. In this room is our World War collection. It's an incredible collection of weapons and equipment from the World Wars. We don't have as much local history here, but we do have some. We have the World War I uniform of Private Jesse Whaley of East Greenwich, Rhode Island. He's drafted in the last year of the war. When he arrives to France, he immediately goes into what's known as the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the biggest battle in scale in World War I, involved millions of people, just epic in scale. And he makes a midnight charge across no man's land between the 2 trenches. And the flare goes off in the sky, and he sees, right when it illuminates the ground, he sees a German rise up out of a hole and throw a grenade towards him. He tries to duck, he says it goes off, it kills the guy on his left, kills the guy on his right, hits him in the temple, a piece of the shrapnel, and it blinds him permanently. And so he would return home unable to see his family, his loved ones. The Army sends him to a special school to learn how to use a Braille machine. And one of the first things that he writes on the Braille machine is a first-hand account of his making this attack of being wounded. It's published in the New York Times. A copy of it here. But he ends up one day getting on a bus after this class to learn how to use the Braille machine. He stumbles, he trips, and a woman is behind him, helps him up, gets him on the bus. She ends up sitting next to him. They start talking, they become friends. They end up getting married, and they had by all family accounts, a wonderful marriage for over 50 years. They had 5 sons together. 2 of the 5 sons are still alive today.